If you're either new into competitive Pokemon or is considering getting into it, or you might just need to up your game a little bit, then this video is for you. This is the complete competitive Pokemon guide. Hi, my name is Berg, and I've been playing competitive Pokemon for around 2 years now, I would say. And I'm still learning new things every single day as I'm playing and getting better. So, without further ado, let's get this video started. Enjoy. Pokemon has a lot of elemental typings such as fire, grass, and water, and many more. Each type has its strengths and weaknesses, forming a complex rock-paper-scissor dynamic that defines the strategic depth of Pokemon battles. Typing is the most important thing in competitive Pokemon because it is what decides whether your Pokemon's attack into another Pokemon is going to be super effective, not very effective, or just effective in general. Because knowing whether your Moonblast is going to do super effective damage or not very effective damage can be the difference between having a KO or being KO'd. So whether if you are a veteran into the world of competitive Pokemon or you're just thinking about starting your journey out right now, then this video is for you. There are 18 types in Pokemon right now. I mean, technically there is 19 if you want to count the Stellar type, but I don't really want to count that because it's part of a gimmick, so it's not really relevant for you right now anyway, so let's forget that and let's stick with the 18 types. Focusing on learning each type's weaknesses or resistance can be crucial to understanding whether your Pokemon is going to be able to take a hit or two in order to survive. Some types, as you can see here on the chart, will do double damage into another type, which is also known as super effective damage. Also, if it says not very effective, that means that the damage is cut in half. To illustrate this on an easier basis, let's take fire type Pokemon. Fire types do super effective damage into grass types, meaning a 70 power base move deals 140 now. However, if they would go for the same move into a water type Pokemon which resists fire, then the 70 power base move will only be a 35 power base move now. That's why when you start out with your playthrough, you can choose between a grass type, fire type, and a water type, so no matter what you choose, it would always balance out. Understanding type strength and weaknesses are crucial to understanding team building. A well-rounded team wants to have Pokemon which can cover for each other weaknesses. For an example, if you have a Rillaboom which is weak to fire, you would most likely want to have a water type next to it which can cover for the fire type weakness. Now that you've been taught the basics of typings, let's move on to something a little bit more complex than that. Not every Pokemon is a pure fire type like Torkoal. Some Pokemon have dual typings such as Charizard, which means that it has two typings. In Charizard's case, this means it is a fire and flying type. Being a dual type means that you can get both resistances and weaknesses from both typings. Let's take Charizard for an example. Charizard's fire type makes him weak to ground, rock, and water, but he resists bug, fairy, fire, grass, ice, and steel. Charizard's flying type makes him weak to electric, ice, and rock, but however, he resists bug, fighting, and grass and is completely immune to ground. You're probably thinking now, wait a minute, how can Charizard be simultaneously weak to ground but also immune to it? Well, if a Pokemon has an immunity and a weakness in its dual typing, that means it will just be immune to it. Dual typing does so both types comes together, so Charizard's fire flying will have a 4-time weakness to rock since both fire and flying types are weak to it. It'll be weak to electric and water as neither flying nor fire cancels out those weaknesses. Charizard resists fire, fairy, fighting, and steel, and then is completely immune to ground types. You're probably thinking, wait a minute, didn't you mention earlier that because of its flying type it has a weakness to ice type? I mean, you're technically right, but hear me out. Since Charizard is weak to the ice type from its flying type, but is also a dual type with having fire, that means the fire type, which is resistant to the ice type, will cancel out the weakness in the flying type section and therefore will be a neutral hit. This is why dual typing can be quite confusing to deal with, but it can also give you an advantage over your opponent. Another reason why typings is important is because if you have a Charizard facing up against a Blastoise, you can think to yourself that the Blastoise most likely will go for a water type move into the Charizard since Charizard is weak to that. So you can switch out your Charizard for Venusaur for example, and Venusaur is a grass poison type and will therefore resist the water type attack. I guess you can compare competitive Pokemon a bit to chess because you're trying to predict your opponent's next move so you can take control over the game. So to understand each type's weakness, resistance, or even immunity can be quite a mouthful, especially when you start taking into account dual typing. My advice for you would to be study a type chart and then memorize what typings are good into what. In general, if you start playing the game a lot, understanding types will come to you naturally after some time. So you don't understand how EVs, IVs, and natures work, then congratulations, you're in the right place. My name is Berg, and in today's video, I'll try to explain to you best how EVs, IVs, and natures works in competitive Pokemon, and how they can help you turn your Pokemon into an absolute unit of a powerhouse. So let's jump right into things. First, let's start off with effort values, or for short, EVs. EVs are crucial for the way you shape your Pokemon, and can be what decides whether you survive just barely or go down. EVs are earned either through battles, vitamins, feathers, training in Sword and Shield, or mochis. The most common way to EV train your Pokemon, however, is with the vitamins and in-game battles. If you want to learn more about how you can EV train your Pokemon, then I suggest you check out this video I made, but finish this one first. Essentially, one vitamin, whether it's a protein or calcium, gains your Pokemon 10 EV stat points and the respective stat which the vitamins represent. So for example, if you give Urshifu 20 proteins, that means it'll gain 200 attack stats. A Pokemon can be given a maximum of 510 EVs, but only 252 of those EVs can go into one single stat, so you need to choose your EV distribution carefully. This essentially means that you can actually only max out 2 stats per Pokemon. For an example, my Raging Bolt in my latest tournament had a max HP and max special attack stat invested, and the 4 remaining EVs were invested into defense. This means that my Raging Bolt gained a whopping 32 extra stats in both HP and special attack, and only 1 in its defense stat. The first 4 IVs you invest into the stat of a Pokemon will add 1 extra stat point per Pokemon stat. After the first 4 EVs, your stat point goes up only if you invest 8 more, so it doesn't matter if you invest 4 more, it won't go up. So this essentially means that if I wanted to invest my EVs into special attack to gain 1 point, I would have to invest 4 EVs in the beginning, but if I wanted my EVs in special attack to go further up, I would have to invest 8 EVs instead of just 4. That means my Raging Ball went from having a 200 base HP stat to a 232 HP stat, and it went from having 172 special attack stat to a 207. And since I had 4 EVs left, I just put them into defense, which then just bumped it up for 1 point. I know this might be a little bit confusing, but try to watch this segment of the video a couple more times to see if it makes more and more sense. Now, let's move on to individual values, or for short, IVs. IVs are individual values which a Pokemon gains when it's either hatched or caught. These stats help with the potential growth of the Pokemon. Each IV stat has a number which range between 0 to 31, with 0 being the worst and 31 the best. In some cases, a 0 IV speed Pokemon can be good for Trick Room teams. For an example, since the slowest Pokemon moves first. In Pokemon Scarlet and Violet, after you completed the game and beat the Elite Four, you'll gain access to be able to check your IVs. All you have to do is hit the plus twice and you can see your IV stat. You'll be able to see your Pokemon is either gonna have a no good, which is equal to 0 IV bonus points. You can also see decent, which can range from 1 to 10 IV bonus points. You can also see pretty good, which can range from 11 to 20. Very good, which range from 21 to 29. Fantastic, which is just 30. And best, which is 31 and is the maximum IV points your Pokemon can get. However, at level 50, which is what competitive Pokemon is played as, it doesn't matter whether your Pokemon has the fantastic IV or the best one, it gives the same result in the end. IVs might be the reason why you've heard the term "I'm breeding for my competitive Pokemon" or "I'm softly setting until I get the right stats." However, in Pokemon Scarlet and Violet, you don't need to do this since the bottle capsule and the gold bottle capsule is very easy to obtain. So what the normal bottle cap does is that it grows the chosen IV stat of your Pokemon from whatever you have up to Hyper Train, which is essentially the same as a best. However, a gold bottle capsule trains all of your IVs at the same time up to the Hyper Trained level. This can be very valuable if you've caught a shiny Pokemon which doesn't have the right stats for competitive play. Next and final on the list, we have Natures. Natures is way easier to understand and way less complex than EVs and IVs. Natures affects one of your stats which boosts it, while it also hinders another one, and some Natures doesn't even do anything at all, but we won't even focus on those because those are not even relevant for competitive play. So essentially in nature does so your Pokemon's chosen stat gets a boost by 10% while it also hinders another stat for 10% as well. This essentially means that you can boost one of your stats with 10% more than usual, but you lose 10% in another stat in exchange. However, it is not as bad as it might sound at first. Because since you rarely, and when I mean rarely, I mean absolutely never use a mixed attack on competitive Pokemon, hinder one of your attack stat doesn't really matter. For example, on Fluttermane, this means we can boost its special attack stat with 10% while lowering its attack stat, which it wouldn't even have used in the first case at all. So in my book, that's a win-win. Another reason why taking 10% off in stat can be beneficial is a Trick Room Pokemon again. If you have a Trick Room Pokemon and you want to make it even slower to give it an edge in Trick Room, then hindering its speed stat by 10% can be quite beneficial. So choosing the right nature for your Pokemon can really make or break whether you move first, get KO'd, or survive an attack. Although if you don't like the nature of which your Pokemon got hatched or caught with, you can just change it with giving it mints. Mints can be found either on the ground or bought at the Challenger Supply for 20,000 Pokecoins or League points. So let us explore what a Pokemon move is, what it does, what Pokemon stats are, because these are crucial fundamentals to understand in order to become a better competitive Pokemon player. So first, let's try to understand what a move in Pokemon actually means. A move is essentially an action your Pokemon can take during a battle. Every move has an effect besides Splash, but we won't focus on that move because it's practically useless, so that's not what we'll be focusing on here. Essentially, a Pokemon can either go for a move which inflicts damage, such as Earthquake, inflicts a status condition such as Spoil, which will put the opposition Pokemon to sleep, boost your Pokemon stats with, for example, a Sword Stance, protect your Pokemon with Protect, Spiking Shield, or Burning Bulwark. You can either deflect a move as well with Follow Me, and there's much more things you can do. Every Pokemon can either learn a wide variety of moves which either deal damage, are defensive, or is supportive. There are three main categories of moves in Pokemon. First off, we have Special Attack, which relies on the Pokemon Special Attack stat and the Pokemon which are being targets Special Defense stat in order to calculate how much damage is dealt. Then we have the attack stat, which is a physical attack, which focuses on the Pokemon's attack stat and the targeted Pokemon's defense stat in order to calculate the damage dealt. Lastly, we have the status move, which doesn't directly deal damage, but it can through something like a secondary effect of Toxic or Burn. It can also paralyze your Pokemon with a move like Thunder Wave, or you could put your Pokemon to sleep with something like a Spore, change your Pokemon's stats with moves such as a Calm Mind. If a Pokemon uses a move which is the same type as the Pokemon already is, it will gain a 1.5 boost. This essentially means that if Charizard uses Flamethrower, which is a fire type like Charizard, then the move will gain a 1.5 boost. This means that essentially the 90 power base move of the Flamethrower will now be a 135 power move. Now let's move on to stats, but what exactly even is stats in Pokemon? Well, it's actually way simpler than you might think. Hear me out. Every Pokemon has 6 different stats which define their abilities and capabilities in battles. First up, we have hit points, or for short HP. HP is essentially your Pokemon's overall health, and the higher the stat is, the more damage your Pokemon can take before it faints. Next up, we have attack. This is the attack stat which your Pokemon uses when inflicting damage with a physical move. After that, we have defense. This is a stat which the Pokemon uses to absorb physical attacks such as Earthquake to calculate how much of its HP will be lost. Then we have speed, which is how fast your Pokemon is, and this will be compared to every Pokemon active on the field to decide which Pokemon goes first. However, if 2 or more Pokemon have the same speed stat, it's called a speed tie. In this scenario, there is a 50-50 or 33-66, 25-75, you get what I'm saying. Chance that your Pokemon will move first, depending on how many Pokemon that has the same speed stat. Essentially, Pokemon just flip a coin and it's a 50-50. Next off, we have this special defense. Special defense is essentially the same as defense. However, instead of taking the attack stat into calculations, this one takes the special attack stat into calculations. Lastly, we have special attack stat, which is the attack stat a Pokemon uses when it uses a special attack move such as Moonblast. So to understand these stats is very important in competitive Pokemon, because if you don't understand these correctly, you can put your Pokemon in serious danger. For example, having a Pokemon with a high speed stat but a low HP stat might be a very good quick sweeper. However, if it doesn't get the KO straight away, it can be very fragile due to its very fragile defense. For example, if you have a Pokemon with a high speed stat and a low HP stat, it is considered a quick sweeper. This can be very good in certain scenarios when you just want to get a hit off very quickly. However, if your Pokemon doesn't pick up that KO, it is in serious danger because of its fragile HP. Obviously, there is endless possibilities in the way you can play your Pokemon, so don't take this as this is the only way you can play them. Obviously, you can play your Pokemon however you want to. This was just 2 different scenarios of how you could play your potential Pokemon. Okay, so first let's start by unwrapping what item is in Pokemon and where you can find it. Items are found in your backpack, and it is essentially something that your Pokemon can either hold or use. No matter if you're playing through your playthrough, exploring the world of Pokemon, catching Pokemons, or battling competitive Pokemon just like me, items are a vital part of Pokemon and can be the difference between victory or defeat. Okay, so essentially items has 2 different functions. So the first function which a item can have, and is probably the one you most likely know the best if you're just a casual Pokemon player, is giving your Pokemon an item such as a potion to heal it up if it's been damaged in battle, heal it if it's been burned or something like that, a stone that can evolve it, most likely on a Pikachu into a Raichu, a rare candy to give your Pokemon more XP and level it up, or maybe vitamins to boost your EV stats. Okay, so the other function a item can has is way less functional than the first one I just explained, and this one, however, is way more stationary. This function is probably the most important one you need to understand if you just want to play competitive Pokemon and don't really want to think about the other stuff I just told you about, because you can't actually use that in competitive Pokemon. So the second one is probably the one that's going to be the most relevant if you are a VGC player. So essentially this can actually help turning your Pokemon into being a mediocre Pokemon into a potential champion in the future. From Choice Scarf, Focus Sash, Life Orb, Assault Vest, competitive Pokemon players utilizes items to either give their Pokemon more power, more speed, or just give them a bit of survivability rate. For example, Chinpound is a well-known Pokemon in the competitive Pokemon world to be carrying the Focus Sash. The reason for this is because Chinpound is a very fragile Pokemon, but it is incredibly fast and incredibly powerful and hard-hitting. This means that if you pair it up with the Focus Sash and add that to Chinpow, it will have to be hit at least twice before going down. This is very useful because Chinpow is a very fragile Pokemon, but because it's so fast, you will most likely outspeed all Pokemons in the field unless they have a speed boost somehow through Tailwind, Booster Energy, or a Choice Scarf perhaps. So you can essentially get 2 hits off at least before your Chinpow goes down. But it just doesn't end here with battle items. In fact, in competitive Pokemon, we also have berries and herbs, which is 2 items with regularly used within competitive Pokemon as well. So essentially what I'm talking about here is that, for an example, if you put a citrus berry on a Pokemon, this will gain your Pokemon 30% back of its HP when it goes below 50%. You can also use a mental herb for an example, which if you use it on have it on a Pokemon, this means that if your Pokemon gets taunted, bored, or get other status condition, it will be immediately cured. But the only thing with the mental herbs and the citrus berries is that they can only be used once unless you have a special ability such as Harvest, which is on Executor. So essentially, to wrap up what items actually do is that you can either use items as a defensive tool to give your Pokemon a better survivability rate, an offensive tool to get yourself some extra power and hit the opposition Pokemon even harder. And so in general, items are just used to contribute to your Pokemon's overall strength. Okay, so now that we have figured out what items are, let's take a look at what abilities does. So abilities is a bit like items, however, with abilities there is much more less options. However, it does add features to your Pokemon which other Pokemons might not be able to get, since every Pokemon in the game can hold every item it wants to hold, but not every Pokemon can access every ability it wants to have. In competitive Pokemon, an ability can play a vital role in whether your Pokemon is actually usable or not. For example, let's take Torkoal. So Torkoal is arguably the slowest Pokemon which are usable within the game. However, usually if you have a very slow Pokemon like Torkoal, you would use it in a Trick Room team. But since Torkoal has the ability Drought, which sets up Sun and Switching, it is actually not necessary to use it in a Trick Room setting because its ability is so powerful. But unlike items which are usually used just for the purpose of one Pokemon, abilities is actually an asset which can power up all of your Pokemon and not just the holder of the ability. So if we go back to the example of Torkoal once again, Torkoal and Switching would set up the Sun with the Drought ability. This can be combined with Fire types, Paradox Pokemons from the past with the Photosynthesis ability, which give a bonus to the highest stat, Executor's Harvest as I mentioned earlier. You basically get the idea. Another ability which is just incredibly broken is the Prankster ability. So essentially what Prankster ability does is that the user status moves will move before any other moves on the field. This will mean that essentially if you use Taunt, Reflect Light Screen, Tailwind, you go before any other Pokemon on the field. Even Urshifu, which has the Unseen Fish, which at first glance might only seem to benefit Urshifu. So essentially what Unseen Fish does is that if Urshifu uses a physical attack but your opponent protected their Pokemon, Urshifu's attack will just break straight through the protect. It actually also benefits the rest of your team because when Urshifu is on the field, your opponent might be scared to protect because it won't matter if Urshifu targets that slot, and in that case your opponent won't even protect, which open up both slots so you can actually attack with both your Pokemon at the same time. So essentially, abilities is an asset which your Pokemon can use in order to become stronger, but certainly also boost your team's overall strength. Essentially, items and abilities are a powerful asset within competitive Pokemon, and it is very vital that you understand how they work, because understanding it can really take your game to the next level. Team building is one of, if not the most important thing to learn within competitive Pokemon, because if you have a bad team, you start off immediately on the back foot and pretty much automatically lose. So for the next 5 minutes, I hope we can cut it down to that at least. I mean, at this point, editor will know, but yeah, we'll be diving deep into the exciting world of team building within competitive Pokemon in order to learn and understand how to craft the ultimate team. Before we can learn how to team build, we must understand what it actually means. You can kind of think of team building as doing Legos or a puzzle. Essentially, think of every Pokemon as a brick. Do your Lego set, and essentially you just want to create the best Lego set ever created before. When creating a team within Pokemon, you want to make sure that your different Pokemon covers each other's weaknesses and complements each other's strength. And if you don't know how to figure out what Pokemon are weak to what, then check out this video I already made on typings, and that will definitely help you understand what weaknesses and different stuff are in terms of typing. So essentially, if you have a grass type like Rillaboom here for an example in your team, which are weak to fire types, you want to cover Rillaboom's weaknesses by adding like either a ground type or water type like Rapid Strike Urshifu. So when you're building your team, as we just talked about, it's important to understand your weaknesses. One way you can see your Pokemon weaknesses, and in general just your overall team's weaknesses and where you might need to add some Pokemon that can cover or strengthen that weakness, can be on the Marioland Team Builder website. I'll leave it down in the description below as well, so you can check it out. I personally use this myself when I team build because it's such a good tool to see where your strengths and weaknesses are. When choosing a Pokemon in your team, it's vital to understand how you want to play. Do you want to be a hyper-offensive player? Then you just have to hit the fastest and hard-hitting Pokemon in the game. For an example, you can use Cameron Shadow Rider, but if you want a little bit more bulk and balance in your team, you might choose a Pokemon like Groudon or Samantha, which can take a bit more than just one hit usually. Maybe you're actually more into a Trick Room where the dimensions are twisted so that it's actually the slowest Pokemon on the field that moves before the faster ones. In this case, a Torkoal or a Calyrex Ice Rider is an absolute phenomenal choice. There are some few things you need to ask yourself before you start creating your team, because answering these questions can help you understand what type of Pokemon you actually want to add to your team. When you're building a team, you just can't add whatever Pokemon you want to add because they might work individually, but if they don't connect as a team, and they don't work as a collective, they might not work out, hence the name team building. To understand this a little bit better, essentially your team is kind of like a car, because you need different parts of your car to function, such as the engine, the brakes, and steering, for the car in general to work. Kind of think of your team like that. For example, you can look for combos that will complement each other, and you can choose a Gouging Fire Howl strategy for an example. This strategy relies on that you have your Gouging Fire howling before your physical attackers such as Chin Pao or Urshifu attacks, in order to boost its physical attack so it can hit even harder. Another example of how you can utilize abilities and moves to create nutty combos could be with the Chiyu's Breath of Ruin, which lowers every Pokemon on the field besides itself, plus your defense with 25%. You could pair this with a Calyrex Shadow Rider in order to utilize its special attack stat and Astral Barrages even more. There's a bunch of different ways where you can combine your Pokemon in order to make the most out of them, so don't worry, you don't have to use the two examples I just gave. They're just kind of a guideline to what you could use for an example. Essentially, when you build your team, you always want to make sure that you, in the back of your head, you have what role do each Pokemon play on your team. Essentially, a good rule of thumb is that you want a Pokemon which can take care of speed control, which could either be with Tailwind, Brick Room, or some Icy Wind, which lowered the opponent's speed stat. So by having a Pokemon that can do speed control, you can pressure your opponent into making plays they don't want to play, but they kind of need to play in order to stay in the game, and you can kind of force a mistake out of them. Speed control is so important within competitive Pokemon. I can actually not stress how important this thing is within competitive Pokemon, because essentially it is what decides what Pokemons move first, and you obviously always want to move first in order to deal as much damage as possible. Essentially, if you don't have the speed control, that can be the difference between your Pokemon getting KO'd or picking up a KO. Another rule of thumb you want to make sure you have on your team is a Spore or Powder immunity in general, such as a Grass type or Safety Goggles item on a Pokemon, because Pokemons like Amoonguss is really powerful in most of the metas with Spore or Rage Powder. So if you can have an immunity to these powders, that is just an incredibly good rule of thumb. And of course, probably one of the most important things within the game is you want to have a sweeper which can hit incredibly hard, and usually you want your sweeper not to be a Pokemon you have to set up like with Sword Dance, Howl, or anything before you attack. You kind of want to make sure that its initial attack stat is high enough that it can pick up KOs without having to be set up first. Having a strong team on paper is not quite enough to have an automatic win, but it can give you a very good advantage though. Team needs to be able to adapt to different scenarios once the game begins. So essentially, be prepared to change your initial strategy and adapt to the game in order to claim your victory. But trainers, remember that team building is much more than what we just talked about. In order to build the best team possible, it's very important that you look at the current meta team in order to either counter it or use the Pokemons from it to maximize the potential of your team. There you go, that is a guide for how to understand team building and the basics of it. I hope today's video helped you and gave you a better understanding of what team building are within Pokemon VGC, also known as competitive Pokemon. And if you have any questions about this, team building, or anything else within Pokemon, especially Pokemon VGC, or other topic you want me to discover, make sure you leave a comment down in the comment section below, and I'll make sure to respond to you down there, or maybe you'll be featured in the next video. Until next time, happy gaming.